Thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. And so I think that most of you have gotten the word on Assemblage that this facility is owned by Karen and Robert and Kathy and Mark LeBaron. And we've had it about 10 years, is that right? It's 10 years now. And it's been a wonderful space. This exhibition is different for us in that this is the first Assemblage exhibition that has not been comprised of works from the Duncans and LeBaron's collections. So instead, there is one piece back at the front that's owned by Karen and Robert. There is a wonderful piece on the lawn that is owned by Kathy and Mark. And so other than that, these works are borrowed and from the Ginnever Foundation. And so in the last, well, Robert mentioned to you that we had had a Ginnever exhibition at the museum in Clarinda, the Clarinda Carnegie Art Museum, and then have worked the last 2 years or so on this exhibition. We worked, and you know this because you have seen the catalog now, and a lot of you have taken the catalogs. We worked with ANCOS on the catalog, and a part of that was, in the bargain, was Jonathan Berger. And so it was a very, very happy and productive team. Not only is this exhibition different in that it is not comprised of pieces from the Duncan and LeBaron collections, it also is a solo exhibition, but beyond that, this exhibition focuses on the first 7 years of Chuck Ginnever's career. And so, luckily, we have the piece of Kathy and Mark LeBaron's that is on the lawn. That is a very recent piece. So that piece was done in 2010. These works were done from 1958 through 67, something like that. So, big difference, decades of difference. But what this has given us an opportunity to do is to look at how Chuck formed his ideas, how he put things together, and wound up with something decades later that looked like Troika. So there are certain things, and Jonathan's going to clarify this for you to a degree. He's going to talk about the group that Chuck operated within too. But if you look at how he uses color, he started using all of this vibrant color painted for various effects, and then left that, eventually kind of returned to it. These pieces also show how he started putting ideas together about how sculpture should enter into the space around it. So his work tends not to be a self-contained object, but something that reaches out. And viewers were very, very important to him. And finally, another thing that you really see just the kernels of in this exhibition is the idea that an object should occupy space and that it needs to invite interest from the viewer on every side. Every angle should have something that is wonderful and interesting to see. And he really worked hard at providing that, and I think he was super successful at doing that. And then another aspect of that, and this is an aspect that isn't necessarily shared in all of his works, but a lot of times you'll see windows. And so you see that beginning in this exhibition. So when you see a window, you not only have the work that you're looking at, you have what's beyond that work that becomes a part of it. And so it really is, it's pretty wonderful work, and it's the kind of thing that, that you look at, and the more you look and the more you learn about him, the more complex you see that it is, and the more you admire him. And so, as Ann Coase has said to both of us, you've drunk the Kool-Aid, and so we kind of have. And so, at any rate, what I know about this is kind of a thimbleful of what Jonathan knows, in part because he has, you were a student at one time. Yeah. And Chuck was a mentor to Jonathan. And so over the years, you did a documentary. Yep. And so he has spent a huge amount of time with Chuck. And has thought a lot about it, has formed some wonderful ideas about how this work functions. And so I'm going to turn this over to Jonathan Berger, and he will tell you more about Chuck Ginnever and the group of which he was a part in New York at the beginning of his career. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Ann. So first of all, I wanted to thank Kathy and Mark LeBaron and Karen and Robert for inviting me here today to present this to you all, and Joanna Hutchinson for the wonderful essay that she wrote in the catalog, and for all of you being here today. So today I was going to focus on Ginnever in the age of assemblage environments and happenings. Here is a self-portrait of Chuck in 1956. He is, at this point, a student at the California School of Fine Arts. And this is kind of right when the beginning of that sort of movement was starting. Next slide, please. Of course, the title of my lecture comes from Alan Capro's book, which he largely wrote in 1959. The book was not published until 1965, which was sort of in the middle of this period of happenings, which was about a little more than a decade. Next slide, please. So here's a ink drawing by Ginnever, circa 1956. He's a student still at the California School of Fine Arts. And you can see that abstract expressionism was all the rage at the time. They had teachers there like Ad Reinhardt, Mark Rothko, and Clifford Still. And you can see that he's certainly looking at abstract expressionism and the gestural qualities. And you can sort of see a very sculptural quality to this that will kind of precede some of his later works from Cornell. Next slide, please. This here is an image of his studio at Cornell. And on the right here, you see a metal sculpture made from found metal steel called Homage to Baccioni. And on the left by the window, you see a couple of railroad ties that would eventually make up his oxbow sculpture, which you see in the front of the gallery up here. Next slide, please. So here is Oxbow as he had it in his thesis exhibition at Cornell. On the left is another untitled wall piece. Next slide, please. This is a work called calligraphic sculpture. It's kind of an early drawing of it before he finalized it. But you can see he's still sort of interested in this idea of calligraphy and Eastern, not just calligraphy, but perspective. Next slide, please. This is calligraphic sculpture as it was displayed in his thesis exhibition in 1959. He subsequently did more work to it, but you can start to see that he's eliminating the base. It's still very much a post and beam construction and very sort of frontal and flat. Next slide, please. Now, 1960, Chuck has moved to New York City. He's enmeshed himself in the avant-garde cultural scene, and he's starting to think about sculpture in a very different way. This little collage is a photograph of calligraphic sculpture in its final state, and he cut it out and he pasted it on the back of a little gallery announcement card. But you can start to see he's trying to think of these things in the environment and all of these little tiny figures here. So he's thinking of these things as enormous in scale. Next slide, please. This is Alan Capro. in 1956, this is a detail of his penny arcade. It's an assemblage with lights and sounds from 1956. Capro is considered the founder of happenings, a term he first coined in 1959, which he characterized as a new form of total art, all-encompassing artistic experience by entirely different means, and as an art of the world as opposed to an art of the studio. Greatly influenced by his teacher, John Cage, who considered theater the richest form because of its enlarged conceptual space and including all of the arts, Capro abandoned easel painting in favor of this new form. Next slide, please. One of the earliest happenings could probably be considered John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, performed by pianist David Tudor in Woodstock in 1952, a piece in 3 parts that lasted a total of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Tudor indicated the beginnings of the parts by closing the keyboard cover and the beginnings by opening, the endings rather, by opening the keyboard cover. Essentially, it was the noises in the room that made up the sound in the score. In other words, the environment or the audience activated the piece. According to Cage, the piece was dependent on the audience, so therefore no two performances were ever alike. Next slide, please. In 1958, Capro wrote an article on Jackson Pollock entitled The Legacy of Pollock, where he referred to Pollock's work as the act of painting, describing how he turned the act of painting into a performance. Of course, this goes back to Harold Rosenberg's description of the abstract expressionists as action painters. Next slide, please. Started in 1959, the Judson Gallery, housed in the basement of the Judson Memorial Church in Greenwich Village, was the site where many artists staged happenings and environments. Pictured here is Jim Dine in front of the Judson, hauling in detritus that would make up his environment piece entitled The House. Then, starting in 1962, the space was used by the Judson Dance Theater, a collective of dancers and composers and visual artists that included Merce Cunningham, John Cage, Yvonne Reiner, Alex and Deborah Hay, among many others. Next slide, please. Along with Capro, Klaus Oldenburg was one of the more inventive artists in the group of performance artists, shown here with his happening Snapshots of the City from 1960. Next slide, please. And along with happenings were environments, whereby installations occupied the whole space and the viewers were active participants walking around them. This is George Siegel's 1961 dinner table, described by Capro as an environmental sculpture. Next slide, please. And here, Yayoi Kusama with her environment of 1964 entitled From the Driving Image Show. Next slide, please. Assemblage played a big part in these movements, and Robert Rauschenberg is perhaps one of the best known of these artists of the period in America. And he collaborated on several works with John Cage, Merce Cunningham, and Yvonne Reiner, and the Judson Theater. Pictured here is his piece entitled Monogram from 1959. It's an assemblage, or a combine, as he called them. Next slide, please. In 1960, Martha Jackson mounted a very influential exhibition entitled New Forms and New Media, for which Klaus Oldenburg designed the poster and the catalog here. And you can see the various names of the artists that were included in the image there. And it was Lawrence Alloway who wrote an essay speaking about junk culture. Next slide, please. And for the first installment of the exhibition, Chuck exhibited his Totem 2 piece from 1957-58, which is on the far left there, next to the Jasper Johns target. Next slide, please. And it was so popular that she did a second iteration of New Forms, New Media, right after, in fact, and Chuck then exhibited his oxbow sculpture in that piece. Next slide, please. Not to be outdone, of course, the MoMA then followed suit and did this exhibition on the art of assemblage in 1961. Next slide, please. And as Capro's interests were moving away from the object-based works and more towards the ephemeral, Oldenburg was still interested in the physical sculptural object. This is a Green Gallery exhibition of 1961. There's a Mark de Suvero, 2 Klaus Oldenburgs on the wall there, and then Ginnever's calligraphic sculpture on the back wall here. Next slide, please. So while still at Cornell, Ginnever started working on a piece entitled Ithaca, which the final version is in this gallery at the back here, at the front rather. And it's composed of found steel and railroad ties. You can see in these early concept drawings that he's trying to work out the details. And there's a couple pieces of steel, but it's mostly wood and some ropes and some chains. And they're still very frontal, very two-dimensional. Next slide, please. Here, another early concept drawing for Ithaca. Same thing, that he's, it's still a kind of a post and beam construction. Next slide, please. But after finishing up at Cornell, he moves to New York City, and he's got a loft space. He brings all of these pieces of lumber to his loft. And across the street from him, there was an old telephone building that was torn down. He sees all of these pieces of bent steel and lugs them across the street to his loft. And you can see how the sculpture starts changing. Next slide, please. In its final form, Ithaca, with no formal base, juts out into space, into the environment, as if it were a Pollock in 3 dimensions. It not only occupies space, it reaches beyond becoming part of the environment and forces the viewer to walk around it. Next slide, please. And this is Ithaca on the cover of Announcement when he exhibited it for the first time at his first solo exhibition at the Allen Stone Gallery in 1961. Next slide, please. This is Alan Capro's yard that was exhibited at the side yard of the Martha Jackson Gallery. And it was Ginnever who made a living by trucking people's artworks to different places, who brought the tires to the site and called up Capro and said, "What do you want me to do with these tires?" Capro told him, "Oh, just throw them out there in the yard and make them look good." Next slide, please. In 1962, Ginnever invited a group of artists that included Alan Capro, Eva Hess, Tom Doyle, Mark DeSuvero, and Peter Farakas, among many others, to participate in the happening entitled Ergo Suits. First staged in Woodstock, New York, and then East Hampton, Long Island, this original poster was designed by Phyllis Yampolsky, then married to Peter Farakas. Notice on the left, up top there, Capro's Death Dance, and below that, toys and games, and below that, motion paintings. Next slide, please. So happenings were not just random events of random chaos. As Capro has noted, they were thought out with a premise or a theme and lots of preparation. Of course, there was room for the unexpected, as viewers were meant to participate in the events, and therefore there was no telling what the final outcome would be. Here are some of Chuck's original notes identifying the participants, the schedule, and who was responsible for what. Next slide, please. And here a sketch working out some ideas for the sculpture costumes themselves. Next slide, please. And here are some sketches for the toys that were mentioned before. You can see here a rocking horse by Mark DeSuvero. Next slide, please. And in this one, up in the upper left, this is a Flintstone mobile, also by Mark DeSuvero, and there's a toy pogo sphere and other various elements. Next slide, please. And this is a sketch working out an idea for what was called the worm dance. Next slide, please. And here is the worm dance. This was a long continuous sleeve of these jersey knit fabrics that Chuck found in the dumpster next to his loft, much like the ones that you see on the wall over here. And it was a bunch of people inside of that crawling around. Next slide, please. This is an image from Capro's book of Capro's Service for the Dead 2. And this was when it was done in East Hampton. You can see Ginnever's sculpture costume there up on the far right. Next slide, please. Taken from original film footage, here you get a sense of the colors of the original scene. As has been noted by scholars, many of these happenings and environments were ephemeral, so that while we have documentation that exists, such as film and photographs and other things, what is lost is the cacophony that made up the events between the artists, the musicians, and noisemakers, as well as the audience. The multiple things that were all happening at the same time. Next slide, please. Here you see Eva Hesse's sculpture costume. It's been said that it was her first foray into sculpture. Next slide, please. And here you see Tom Doyle's costume. Next slide, please. And then here was Ginnever's sculpture costume. Next slide, please. Here you see both Hess and Doyle's costume with the inhabitants walking away. Chuck has said that Eva was too shy to dance in her costume, so someone else had to dance in hers. Next slide, please. Also, as part of Ergo Suit's happening, there were what were described on the poster seen earlier as motion paintings. Ginnever had given several artists blank cash register rolls to then paint. He then assigned different people in the audience a color to which they were to play an instrument or noisemaker, probably a lot noisier than Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. But the audience, of course, played the part. Next slide, please. Here are several of Ginnever's painted tapes for motion paintings called Sound Score for Opaque Projector, which you see on the wall over here. Next slide, please. So by the mid-60s, happenings were in full swing. Ginnever was thinking about how to further push the boundaries of sculpture in the environment and making the viewer an active participant, much like he did with happenings. Here is a very early conceptual drawing for his seminal Dante's Rig of 1965. Notice the figures on the swing at the left and the figure that engages the piece, which is on wheels. Next slide, please. Further developing these concepts, and for the first time, Ginnever used new purchased materials, some of which came from a boat shop, including stainless steel wires and hardware that he incorporated, with fabricated bent steel sails or wings with parallelogram shapes cut out of their centers. Next slide, please. The completed sculpture was something entirely new in sculpture, whereby the typical vertical and horizontal axes are thrown off. The aluminum sails or wings are suspended from articulating crossbars, and all of these elements are tethered together with stainless steel wires under tension, causing the individual parts to move with the slightest provocation, such as when a viewer creates a draft while walking by. Next slide, please. So in these last two images of the piece, when dramatically lit indoors, you can see the vocabulary of Ginnever's work to follow. I don't know if you look at the shadows on the wall here, they look very much like his Kitsune sculpture from much later. Next slide, please. Fast forward several years, 1969, while Ginnever was heading the art department at Windham College in Putney, Ginnever and some other artists came up with the idea of creating a carnival. He enlisted his students and friends to stage another happening or sculpture dance, along with multiple other events that took place at the same time. The sculpture dance was an attack on the Edward Durrell Stone-designed colonnade meant to protect students in winter months. The Gazette pictured here was designed by Peter Farakis. And on the back, on the right here is the back of the Gazette, and you can see it's a map, and at the bottom it talks about, number 13 is Ginnever's sculpture dance, and if you look at the image up there at number 13, it's kind of a diagram of the piece that you see on the wall over here. Next slide, please. And then in opening the Gazette, you see the same thing. There's a diagram up here, kind of a conceptual phase of the piece that you see back here. Next slide, please. And just like Ergo Suits, Ginnever made many preparatory notes and drawings outlining the premise of the piece, design notes and costumes, and organizational notes. Interesting to note here on the left, he breaks the performance into 3 sequences and gives each a descriptive term. Expressionist for the first sequence, surrealist for the second sequence, and pageant for the third, where he writes greater crowd participation, especially at climax, in true happening form whereby the viewers are the active participants. Next slide, please. Here we see Ginnever's sculpture costume at its starting point of the happening where, as it was illustrated on the back cover, you can see that this was a much larger piece than what's here. We didn't have the space to go up as high as that. Next slide, please. And here we see it with the backdrop of the colonnade. Next slide, please. Here we see the start of the attack. Next slide, please. One thing I would like to point out here, as I did earlier, is how Ginnever's early Dante's Rig influenced so much of his later work. Look at the similarities here with the triangulated forms, the wings and sails and rigging, holding everything together. Next slide, please. This is an image of the college today, which is now called Landmark College, with its colonnade now extending the entire quad. Next slide, please. And here is the backdrop of the colonnade where they performed. You can see Ginnever's piece For the Fifth of Beethoven is now installed in the background up there by the dormitory. So I want to leave you with one last thing, but I would like to have you keep in mind that this is some original film footage that was edited by a friend of Ginnever's, and he added the music. So you have to kind of not think about the music when you're looking at this, but it was probably much more of a cacophonous event. Next slide, please. Thank you.